So, if you're anything like me, you weren't raised in a religious context. If anything, you were raised in a somewhat spiritual context where one parent was maybe open spiritually, but neither parent were specifically religious or strict in their faith. If you're anything like I was, you might be agnostic. And I know for myself, there was this entire ideological journey that went something like, well, I don't know what exists out there. I can feel that there's something more to the world or the universe or life than it physically presents. But I also don't think that there's some man in the sky who's pulling the strings of my life. It boils down to this belief of a higher power, but just unsureness in what it was. Also, if you're anything like me, you've probably met some people who were atheist, and meeting those people made you not want to be an atheist for one reason or another. And it wasn't until I was in my early to mid 20s that I started having conversations with mentors and family who started developing a relationship with God themselves. And they would talk about God not as this religious, dogmatic ideology. I think this is like the traditional viewpoint of God that tends to drive away people when it comes to the whole God conversation. So the idea of a God that is punitive, the idea of a God that will punish you for doing wrong things, the idea of a God that is looking down upon everybody and judging you. I think that's the overly humanized perspective that has kind of come to fruition within the course of the last 2,000 years of a God that will judge you for doing wrong. No, they weren't talking about God like that. They were talking about God like something very sacred, something that is ever present. I don't know. They would say things like, I thank God for you. Thank God for this moment. I thank God for this food. I thank God for the opportunity to live, to wake up, to breathe today. And during that time, I was dealing with some pretty challenging things. I had a friend who had committed suicide. At that point, I had dropped out of college. I had lost a lot of money. It was my first time losing a lot of money. And my self-worth was completely tied to all of the things that I was going through. And so I kind of had none at that point in time. My journey is a little bit different than most people's, I would say. I did ayahuasca, and it was interesting because my family actually all did ayahuasca before I ever did ayahuasca. My uncle is actually a co-founder of a Costa Rican ayahuasca medical retreat center. I didn't know all this. I learned that pretty recently. So when I opened up about what I was going through at the time, my family and family friends and mentors suggested that I do ayahuasca. And it wasn't like out of nowhere. I had been in the exploration of personal development for a long time. I had been meditating since I was 18. At this point in my life, I was 24. It seemed like a logical next step for me. It was terrifying, the idea of it. I didn't really know what to expect. I feared that I would lose control of myself. I guess if I really am honest with myself, looking back, I feared that I would lose the comforts of my life, the things that I was holding on to kind of cope with the reality that I was at. And so my first ayahuasca experience wasn't crazy deep, but it kind of opened me up to the possibility, the idea that I was not always alone. I actually had this moment of vulnerability during that ceremony where one of the helpers came over to me, and I guess I was 1 to 2 cups in at that point. And I just kind of blurted out, I was terrified of being alone. And that's not something that I thought about before. I always thought that I was very comfortable being alone. Looking back, I was kind of distracting myself from being alone. I still do this more often than I would like to, but spending time by myself, doing things that kind of distracted me from being with myself actually, like sitting there, being with my thoughts, being with my emotions, just being with the present moment, if nothing else. And so, yeah, in that moment, I said, I am afraid to be alone. And the helper looked at me, and in that state, in that setting, it just really landed when she said, you're never alone. God is always with you. And I really heard her at a different, deeper level than I normally listen to things like that before that point. I was like, maybe maybe God is always with me. I've never considered that before. Never considered that I'm not actually alone when I'm by myself. What a novel idea. And after that first ceremony, I felt that I had come into contact with something very real that was always there, an energy source. I felt like touched by a presence, an energy that was always with me that I'd just maybe never really noticed before. And so what I started to do was I started to give thanks. I would be in bed and I would just say, thank you, God, for my life. Thank you, God, for today. Thank you, God, for my journey. And this was not an easy time for me. This was during COVID, and I was just dealing with a lot of stuff. And there were nights where I would cry myself to sleep. And even in the midst of crying myself to sleep, I would still say, thank you, God, for my life. Thank you, God, for this pain. Thank you, God, for this journey. And in that process, what I started to really get present to was really that I wasn't alone. I started to experience a connection with something higher, something greater, something that was beyond me, but also a part of me. I would reinforce that connection through my meditations. I would reinforce that connection through prayer. I would reinforce that connection through being in nature, just spending time by myself, being with family, being with loved ones. And that connection got stronger. I can definitely say that since that point, I started to become much more open, less skeptical. I started to really just allow myself to consider the possibility that there was way more to reality than I could possibly ever comprehend or understand. I was so sure about many things about myself that did not empower me. I was so sure that I was not gonna win again. I was so sure that I was wrong for doing certain things that I did in my life. Really connecting with God in that way allowed me to start to see myself from a different perspective that wasn't so critical and wasn't so harsh. And I still bring that practice with me today. It's challenging. It hasn't been the easiest thing in the world. And I've made many mistakes. I've made big mistakes that have cost me big things. But through it all, I've gotten to experience this extraordinarily deep presence, this deep experience of life. I feel many things so deeply. I am not the most loud person. I struggle sometimes to put my feelings and experiences into words that actually land with other people. But underneath all of that has been this extraordinarily deep and profound experience of life that I would never have gotten to really dive into if I hadn't gone off of that path and done something kind of out there, like doing ayahuasca. It just opened up this entire world of what's possible to experience, the indigenous cultures that do those things regularly, what they believe, what they experience, what they see, and being able to put myself into that experience really taught me a lot. And so going back to the original point of being agnostic, we'll really break down what that means. Gnostic is to practice, and a, in this context as a prefix, is not. So agnostic is not practiced. And so if you're agnostic, it's a great place to start because by definition, it just means that you haven't really started. At this point in my journey, I'm extraordinarily grateful for all the spiritual insights that I've been blessed to receive. And my job to actually bring them into reality and practice them has not been easy, but it definitely gives a deeper sense of purpose and meaning to my life, which wouldn't have been there otherwise. It makes life make more sense at the end of the day. In a world that's so full of distractions and people vying for your attention that don't want the best for you, they just want your money, a materialistic consumerist reality. I think it's refreshing to tap into something deeper. Allow yourself to believe in the sacredness. Allow yourself to believe in the magic. I think that is one of the biggest things for me, is just allowing myself to believe in the magic of reality. Because when you believe in it and you start to look for it, you start to see things, you start to receive things that maybe you wouldn't have ever seen before, wouldn't have ever gotten. And if the cynics say that something is coincidence, or they say whatever they say, then you kind of just, let that be their perspective, understanding like they don't believe in the magic, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to believe in the magic. And when you start to believe in the more subtle forces of reality, I think life starts to get a lot more interesting. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you again.